October 23, 1942. El Alamein, Egypt. As the sun dropped behind the dunes, the desert winds howled with an eerie silence. Thousands of Allied troops stood ready for battle, among them a group of rugged Australian engineers and infantrymen known simply as diggers. But these men weren't holding rifles. They were holding canvas, cardboard, wooden frames, buckets of paint, and blueprints for a deception so bold it would fool one of Nazi Germany's greatest commanders, Erwin Rommel, the infamous Desert Fox. For months, the Axis and Allied forces had been locked in a brutal stalemate along the North African front. Rommel's Afrika Korps had dug in deep. Mines stretched for miles. German panzer divisions patrolled every road and ridge. Any offensive would come at a massive cost. But British Commander General Bernard Montgomery had a plan, and the Australians would be key to executing it. His idea? Make the Germans believe the main Allied assault would come from the south while the real attack would strike from the north. But to sell the illusion, he needed more than fake maps. He needed a fake army. Enter the Australians. They had a reputation: resourceful, practical, fearless, and most importantly, creative. Their job was to build a phantom force in the southern sector, a complete invasion illusion crafted from wood, rubber, and canvas. Fake tanks, fake artillery, fake fuel depots, fake supply trucks, even fake landing craft made to look like they were being assembled near the coast, and the entire project had to be built under strict secrecy in the middle of a war zone. Working in silence under moonlight, the Australians constructed what would later be called Operation Bertram, a deception so intricate that it changed the course of the war. To the untrained eye, it was just plywood and rope. But through German binoculars, it was an army ready to strike. By day, decoys were covered with camouflage nets. By night, teams moved dummy tanks using simple levers and pulleys. Australian drivers dragged scrap tires behind jeeps to simulate the tracks of entire battalions. They even broadcast fake radio chatter using recordings of real officers. And Rommel believed it. German intelligence picked up on the signs. Sudden troop movement in the south. New tanks parked on ridges. Supply routes being laid down. Rumors of an amphibious force preparing to land. By the time the real Allied attack launched in the north on October 23rd, Rommel had repositioned a large portion of his defenses, falling straight into the trap. It wasn't brute force that broke the Axis lines at El Alamein. It was imagination. And at the heart of that deception were a group of Aussie diggers who turned cardboard into strategy. The desert was unforgiving. Heat by day, freezing winds by night, sand that got into every gear, every boot, every breath. And still, the Australians worked. They weren't just soldiers. They were painters, carpenters, engineers, and pranksters. Each night they pushed deeper into the deception. What began as a few wooden shells evolved into a coordinated theatrical production with hundreds of participants, fake logistics lines, sound design, and psychological operations. Their tools were simple: sheets of tin shaped into tank hulls, canvas stretched over wooden frames to resemble artillery, inflatable rubber dummies that swayed just enough in the wind to look real from a distance. But their understanding of human perception, that was complex. They knew how long it took German reconnaissance planes to pass overhead. They knew the angles of shadows at different hours. They even calculated how tire tracks needed to curve to simulate a heavy convoy turning under load. The Australians had a key advantage. They didn't take themselves too seriously. While other Allied units scoffed at the idea of fake tanks, the diggers embraced it with a wry smile and full commitment. One soldier joked, "If this war's going to be a joke, might as well make it a good one." But it wasn't a joke. It was life or death. Because if the Germans realized it was all fake, if even one scout noticed the plywood was too thin or the fuel drums were empty, the entire plan would collapse. To sell the illusion further, they staged dummy supply drops from aircraft. They constructed fake roads using strips of fabric. They built phony fuel depots complete with barrels painted to look full. They even placed staged newspapers and letters in fake tents so that if a German patrol stumbled upon the site, they'd find evidence of a real unit. British intelligence called it tactical theater. The Australians called it bushcraft meets BS. One of the most brilliant elements was how the Australians managed motion. The German Luftwaffe had learned to spot fakes by lack of movement. So the diggers rotated the positions of dummy tanks every few days. Sometimes they'd shift them a few meters. Other times they'd leave real tank tracks near the dummies to reinforce the illusion. In some cases, they even used mirrors and reflective panels to mimic the glint of moving metal under the sun. To the Germans, it looked like real preparations. To the Australians, it was a performance, but not everyone believed it would work. Some British officers doubted the plan. Some American advisors warned that Rommel isn't that stupid. Others thought the ruse would buy them a day or two at best. They were wrong, because Rommel believed it for over a week. He diverted resources, delayed counterattacks, and by the time he realized what was happening, the Allied tanks had already broken through the north. The cardboard army didn't just distract the enemy, it bought time, and in war, time is everything. When the dust settled over El Alamein and the smoke cleared from the wreckage of Rommel's retreat, historians would later mark the battle as a turning point in the North African campaign. But behind that victory lay the shadows of plywood and paintbrushes. The Australians, once dismissed as rough-edged bushmen, had just outwitted one of Hitler's most feared generals. And word got out. The British High Command was stunned by the operation's success. Operation Bertram, they said, had redefined the art of military misdirection. They sent a formal commendation to the deception units, but few knew just how much of the credit belonged to the Australians, because most of what they had done wasn't written down. It wasn't documented. It wasn't broadcast. It was hidden in crates of camouflage netting, and stories passed between soldiers over campfires. But within those stories, the legend of the cardboard army began to grow. In the months that followed, elements of the Australian Deception Corps were quietly reassigned to other fronts. Some worked in Burma, crafting fake artillery on jungle trails. Others assisted British teams in Italy, creating ghost convoys to lure German forces away from real landing zones. In one operation, Australian engineers designed a fake harbor, complete with sound effects, to suggest an incoming naval invasion. The Germans bit. They repositioned troops, delaying their response to a real assault happening miles away. But beyond the battlefield, Australia's role in deception warfare began influencing future generations. The British Ghost Army, later celebrated for its work in Normandy, borrowed techniques pioneered by Australian teams in the desert. American units studying psychological operations analyzed notes and photos from Australian field reports to understand how visual trickery could control perception. Even during the Cold War, some of these same methods, camouflage, dummy equipment, sound staging, were revived by NATO intelligence groups who had studied the diggers' work decades before. Yet for all their impact, most of these Australians returned home quietly. No parades, no medals. Some couldn't even tell their families what they had done because the operations remained classified. And when asked what they'd contributed to the war, many just said, "We moved some gear around, nothing fancy." But those who knew, knew. They didn't just move gear. They moved entire enemy divisions with cardboard wit and guts. In war, it's often the names of generals and battles that fill the history books. But what about the ones who fooled the enemy without ever firing a shot? Men like Captain Bruce the Magician Walker, an Australian engineer who pioneered some of the dummy tank designs used in Operation Bertram. He came from a family of painters in Melbourne and applied his artistic eye not to a canvas, but to the deserts of North Africa. Walker understood light, shadow, and perception. He knew that a tank seen from 400 meters at sunset didn't need armor. It needed shape, movement, and dust. He once said, "If a German believes it's real for even 5 minutes, we've already won those 5 minutes." Then there was Lieutenant Jack Ropes Donovan, a wiry Tasmanian who designed pulleys and cable systems to allow small crews to drive dummy tanks across the sand. He wasn't a soldier by trade. He had been a theater stagehand before the war. In one of the unit's logs, Donovan scribbled, "This is the only war where I get paid for not being shot at. I'll take it." Donovan and his team crafted illusions that moved like machines and sounded like armor, all using salvaged Jeep parts, cloth, and desert grit. Beyond the names, there was the mindset. These Australians weren't just building fakes. They were playing with the enemy's mind. They knew how soldiers thought, how officers overanalyzed. They turned that paranoia into a weapon. German intelligence units became obsessed with patterns. They tracked supply routes, fuel movements, tire tracks, and the Australians gave them exactly what they wanted. But it was all a lie. Every detail, every track in the sand, was part of a greater psychological operation. And it worked because it never felt like theater. It felt real. Historians now believe that the mental fatigue Rommel's forces experienced at El Alamein wasn't just from the battles, but from the confusion. One day, they saw tanks where there were none. The next, those tanks vanished. The desert whispered lies. It made them second-guess every report, every scout, every sound. This confusion delayed counterattacks, created breakdowns in communication, and fractured confidence. It wasn't just battlefield manipulation, it was psychological attrition. But when the war ended, no statues were built for the cardboard army, no medals for illusion, no honors for shadows. Some of the Australians involved returned home to work in construction, painting, theater, their wartime contributions buried beneath the mythos of infantry charges and bombing raids. Only decades later, through declassified documents and memoirs, did their ingenuity come to light. Military colleges now study their work under the field of tactical deception, a term that didn't even exist in 1942. Perhaps the most poetic irony is that the Australians who mastered the art of illusion ended up becoming invisible themselves, forgotten by time, overshadowed by louder victories. But their story lives on in the silent moments of every battle where an enemy hesitates, where a commander doubts, where a decision is delayed because of something that isn't even real. That hesitation, that's where the cardboard army still wins, long after the guns have fallen silent. In war, we celebrate strength. We remember the thunder of tanks, the roar of planes, and the sacrifice of those who stood and fought. But history isn't only shaped by firepower. Sometimes it's shaped by silence, by trickery, by a shadow that never existed. The Australian diggers who built a cardboard army did not set out to become legends. They weren't chasing glory. They were just doing their part, with rope, wood, and grit. They didn't fire the biggest guns. They didn't storm the beaches. But they won time. And in war, time can be everything. Their tools weren't bullets. They were brushes. They used illusion the way others used rifles. They made generals doubt. They made enemies hesitate. And they helped shift the tide of one of World War II's most crucial battles. Yet, for decades, they were forgotten. Their war was too quiet, too clever, too strange. But today, as we revisit these hidden stories, we uncover not just a new chapter in military history, but a reminder that brains can outmatch bullets and that creativity, even in war, can change the world. So the next time you hear about El Alamein or Rommel's retreat, remember the tanks made of wood, the artillery made of canvas, and the soldiers who turned the art of deception into a weapon of victory. The diggers didn't just fight the Axis, they fooled them, and for that, they deserve to be remembered.